Hello, this is going to be a tutorial on PlayerPrefs. If you don't know what PlayerPrefs is, it's a way to store data between uses of the application. It's basically like storing a setting. It's kind of like storing it through JSON, except I would say PlayerPrefs you don't want to use for player data, you only want to use it for setting information. And the reason for that is with using JSON, you can much more easily store a bunch of the same type of values, objects. It's much easier to do with JSON than PlayerPrefs because PlayerPrefs require you to use a string as the identifier of the thing you want to look up, the player pref you want to look up. And if you're trying to store a bunch of the same things, like let's say you want to store something called an object called data, and let's say you want to store 10 of them, you'd have to store the first one, you could call it data, the second one you could call it data 1, then data 2, then data 3, then data 4, etc. And so every time you're storing a new data, you have to give it a new string name as the reference. And then when you're loading them, you have to do the same thing in reverse. You have to grab based on the number of data points using whatever string you decide. It's much more complicated than using JSON, where you can serialize objects and then deserialize them using Unity's built-in JSON utility. So in this the case where you would use PlayerPrefs is when you are storing settings information or information that there is only going to be one version of. So, for instance, maybe you want to store the setting for the date. There's only going to be one date setting, and so that might be something you want to store in PlayerPrefs. Or maybe the username of the user. That might be something you want to store in PlayerPrefs. Just know that whatever you store in PlayerPrefs will be persistent between different uses of the application. So if you close the application and open it again, the PlayerPrefs, because it's stored in some file outside of the application, will still be persistent. Okay, so I'm creating a new 2D project, and we're just going to go through how we would use PlayerPrefs to do a very simple adjustment to the background of this. Well, you'll see. Okay, we've opened the new project. Let me close some stuff real quick. Okay, so I'm just going to create a new scene, and we're going to call it PlayerPrefs scene. And I'm going to create a panel. This will be our main background. And also, I kind of want this to have more of a mobile look, so I'm going to switch to a mobile resolution. And then I'm just going to make this background color a solid color, and I don't want to use this background. And let me just turn it to, let's say, blue or something. Okay. So we've got our background. I'm going to now create some text. I'm going to call this homepage. Let's go to scene view, and let's hit F so that we can focus on it. We have text selected and we hit F, we will focus on it. Okay. And then I'm going to switch to this move tool. You can also use W to switch to move tool. I'm just going to move this up right about there. I'm going to do something I normally do where I add the anchors to corner option. So I'm going to import a new asset. Let me go to my downloads. If you want to find this, just look up Unity UGUI tools, and you should be able to find this file. I'm going to get rid of this real quick. There we go. And then that'll allow me to, if you don't know what this is for, try looking at my login tutorial video. Anyway, so I'm going to use this on this text to bring the anchors up. I'm going to resize my, well, let's change the color first so we can see it. Let's make it white. And I'm going to resize the font size. Let's just use best fit. I'm going to center it. And then let's also make sure, yes, the X is 0, which means it's centered. So it's centered on the page. Okay, I think I want it to be bigger. So I'm going to switch it back to the center anchor. Increase the width a little bit, increase the height by more. There we go. And now that that looks the way I want it to, I'm going to anchor the corners again. Okay, and then I think I'm going to make it bold. Okay, so there's our title. This should actually be a child of the panel. And then what I also want in the panel is a button. I'm going to place down at the bottom here. Once again, I'm going to change the width. I'm just going to have it be the same as the text above. And we'll call this settings. So this will be a button that opens up a settings menu. And I'm just going to change the text to settings. Let's again do best fit. It's centered. Let's make it bold as well. And let's change the color of the text to be white as well. And we'll change the button color to be, let's just do a gray. Darker, lighter gray. Okay. So this will be our settings button. I forgot to anchors to corner. Okay, and then I'm also going to want another panel. This will be our settings panel. Let's call it that. So once we hit the settings button, this will activate or open or whatever you want to call it. I'm going to reduce the size of this. So if I go back up to here to this scale tool, actually not scale, sorry, the rect tool, should be able to place this the way I want. Something like that. I think I'm going to bring this into. Yeah, that's fine. So it is centered. There we go. I'm going to use the UGUI tools once again to bring the anchors to corners. I'm just going to zero out these. There's some slight rounding errors when you do this, so if you zero them out, then it should be good. I do think I want this to be somewhat transparent. Again, I don't want this background. I'll change it to none. I do want this to be somewhat transparent. And I want it to be grayer. Maybe it should even be the same color as this button. Let's grab that color. Alright, I just grabbed the wrong color. Oops. This color. So all I did was I grabbed the hexadecimal and I moved it. Oops. And copy paste it. Okay. So here's our panel. This will be our settings panel. I'm going to add a text now. So this settings panel, for now, the only thing you're going to be able to do is use it to change the color of this background, this blue background. Okay, so once again, I'm going to move this up. I'm going to increase its width, increase its height, move it down a little bit again. This will say background color. Center it. Bold. I think that's fine. Let's UGUI to anchor to corners. Great. Oops. Okay. And then next, I'm going to want some little buttons, some more buttons. Let's actually, when you want to child something directly, instead of having to create the game object and make it a child, you can right-click on any object in the hierarchy, and you can do the same thing you would with game object, and instead of placing it on the outside, the furthest outside of the hierarchy, it'll place it as a child. So, which in this case I want it to be a child. So this sprite, I actually want it to be a circle, so I'm going to use a knob. And here's where the colors will matter more. But I think I actually want to create a layout group as well. For now, I'm just going to call this color button. And before I do anything with this color button, I'm going to right-click on the settings panel again and create another panel. I'm creating all these panels because panels are very good for holding UI objects. So whenever you're starting some sort of new spacing, I suggest you always use a panel to be the parent. It'll help you organize a lot better. I'm going to switch back to the rect tool, move this something like that. And in this case, I don't actually want this background, but for now I'm going to leave it so I can see where it is and what it looks like. Maybe even like that. Anchors to corners again. Let's change this to the color button panel. And let's now drag this color button in. And let's also add a, let's see, what do we want to, let's add a horizontal, let's add a grid layout group. So I was trying to decide if we did a horizontal layout group, we could probably only fit maybe 3 of these circles, and it would probably only go to here. If we did a vertical layout group, we'd fit 3 this way. If we do a grid layout group, we can make a grid which is horizontal and vertical. So that's why I chose the grid layout group here. In some cases, you might even want to do 3 vertical or 3 horizontal layout groups instead, because the grid has some limitations. The grid layout group has some limitations. Okay, so I'm going to create a prefab folder. Oh, so first create a folder, prefabs, and then I'm going to drag in this color button. Now it's a prefab, and then I'm going to copy it. And let's see, I want to add some spacing. So I'm going to go back to my color button panel that has this grid layout group, and I'm going to add some spacing in the X direction. Let's make it 20. And we'll do the same in the Y direction. We might need to change that, but for now we'll do that. And then I'm just going to keep adding these. Okay, so it's overlaying a little bit. So with this prefab, I'm going to change the width and height a little bit. I'm going to have to use an actual object to do that. Actually, never mind, because this layout group sets the width and height. So let's use 80. Little too little. Let's try 90, 95. Okay, 95 seems good. We will need to add a little more spacing now. Actually, we'll need to add a little padding too. Maybe just padding. There we go. Okay, that looks good. Okay, so there's our layout group. Each of these buttons we do not need to UGUI anchors to corners, because since they're under a layout group, they're a child of a layout group, this grid layout group, the anchors are already set for us. And the UGUI will actually screw things up rather than helping here. So do not anchor to corners, these buttons. Okay? Okay, and now what we're going to do is each of these buttons, well, let's start by creating a script. So let's create a folder, because we're basically done now with everything we're going to do UI-wise. So let's create a folder. Let's be scripts folder. Let me fix one last thing. I said I was going to turn off this background. Now I'm going to. I'm just going to make it transparent, completely transparent, by changing this alpha value to 0. There we go. This is actually a little hard to read, so let's change that to black. Great. Okay, so I'm going to go to the scripts folder. I'm going to create a new C# script inside the scripts folder, and we're going to call this settings manager, and I'm going to open it up. Okay, here's our settings manager script. I'm just going to delete the start and update. I'll add those back if needed. And I'm going to want to have access to each of those buttons. So I'm going to start by creating a public button array. Okay. So button doesn't exist in this current context because I have not said using Unity engine.ui. So if you ever can't find button, this is why. You need to make sure you say using Unity engine UI. So I'm making an array of buttons. I'm making it public so that I can add them in the editor. And this will just be called color buttons. Okay. Do I need anything else? Not at the moment, I don't think. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function, and this function will be attached to each button. So this will be change background color. It will not need any parameters. So we do need to know which button we chose, which background color button we chose. There's a couple ways we can do this. We can actually, okay. So so I'll go over the couple ways we can do this. We can have this parameter take an integer, and then in the editor, we can have each button be assigned a different integer. So we could have this be the 0 button, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then when you click it, it knows which button you pressed. I don't want to have to input that many numbers, so instead what I'm going to do is in start, I'm going to loop through these color buttons. So for each button, color button in color buttons. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a listener. Okay? So this listener is how we give it a function to call when the button is clicked. And normally we do this in the editor. You just attach an object, like here for an example. Normally with, oh, these are images, these aren't even buttons. Okay, so let me add a button component, and let me apply that to the prefab really quick. So I've added a button to one of these, right? If I go to overrides, I could apply this by itself, but since I've only made one change, I can just use apply all. And now every color button should have a button component. Okay, so back to what I was saying now. Normally, when you want to add a function to a button, you go to this onClick event in the button component. You click the plus, you select some sort of object. I'm just going to use this for an example. And then you would find the script here, and you would select the function. Okay. There's a way you can do this entirely through script, and when you do it through script, you have more control over the parameters. Okay. So in this specific case, what I want the button that's being used to be a parameter to this change background color function. I want to be able to take in a button, a color button, and then I want to use that color button to, well, I just want to use that color button. I'll go into how we're going to use it later. Okay, and so if I were to use, let's say I were to just, let's just have this return for now. I just want to show you why I'm doing this. Okay, so let's say I'm using that function. Let me create empty real quick. Empty game object. We're going to call this the settings manager. I'm going to reset its position. It starts at a weird position. 0 is just so we can find it easier, not that we need to. And then I'm going to plug in this script, this settings manager. And let's put in all of our buttons. We have 9 buttons. And you could put each button in individually, but a nice trick, actually I should delete this 9. A nice trick is, well, first of all, we need to lock this. So we need the settings manager and the inspector to be locked, so when we click on something else, it doesn't switch to a new object. So to do that, you click on this little lock here. Okay? See this lock here? And then now I can click wherever I want and the inspector doesn't change. Okay, the next thing we do is we're going to click on the first button, hold shift, select all of them, drag all the buttons, and make sure you hover it over this color buttons text. It won't work if you hover it here. You can see it doesn't show up. Same here. You need to hover it over the text up here. Drop it in and it puts them all in. Okay, and so now if we go to each of these buttons, we have to unlock in order to see the button. We go to this onClick event, we add the settings manager, and we add that function we just created, which I did not make it public. So it's not showing up here because I didn't make it public. So this needs to be public void. Okay, and then now let's go back here. And it should show up. Change background color button. So I can give each of these, I can drag this in manually for each of these. Something else you should know about why we would want to use a listener. Well, okay, so the first reason is so we don't have to drag everything in manually. The second reason is if I want to add 2 parameters, I'm just going to call this tests. If I want to add 2 parameters, give it a sec to reload. You see, now it doesn't even show up. So this onClick is limited to 1 parameter. And sometimes, if the parameter isn't serializable, it won't even allow you to see it won't even allow you to put anything into the this field. Okay, so sometimes it's just better to manually, or it's not manually, to do it through code. Okay, So we're going to do this through code instead, just because it's harder. No, it's not harder. It's easier in the long run, but it might be harder to understand, and I think it's a good thing for you to try to learn. So back to what we were doing. We were looping through all the buttons, and we're going to add a listener. And remember, adding a listener on click is the same as adding a listener here on click. The only difference is we have more freedom to do what we want if we do it through code. Okay, so we're going to add a listener, and this listener, it takes in a method. So this right here, this function, this is a method. If we gave it change background color just by itself, that would be a method. Now change background color requires a parameter. Okay, and so because it requires a parameter, we can't use change background color. We can't give it a parameter either. Like, watch what happens if I do something like this. Yeah, so it's not a Unity action. Okay, it's not. We're giving it a specific example instead of a method. We're giving it a specific example of a function instead of just a callable method. Okay, and so the way we resolve that is we use delegate. Delegate basically creates an inline function, and inside this inline function we can call our function. Okay, and now we would give it color button, and then that is how we would create an add listener. Now there's one thing to note when doing this as well. If your parameter, if your variable you're using for your parameter is something that is changing, so in this case, each iteration of the for loop is going to be changing. By the time we actually click this button, it will have finished this for loop, right? All of these buttons will have received these listeners. And so all of these buttons, this variable will actually end up being the last color button. Okay, and so for each of the buttons, they will all have the same parameter value, which we don't want. This means that when the player clicks on any button, it'll be the same as clicking on the last button, or at least what we want to happen when you click on the last button. So to try to explain what I mean, we're going to loop through each of these buttons, and we're going to add this onClick listener. So we start with this button, and let's say the color is blue. Okay. Let's say this button, the color is red. So the first button, we change the color to blue. The second button, we change the color to red. Well, guess what? Since we're using the same variable, now the first button is also equal to red. And then let's say we go to the third button and say it's yellow. Well, since we're using the same variables for these two, now these two are yellow. And then so on until you get to the last one. Let's say it's black. Now every single one before it is black because it's using the same variable name. So the way around that is inside the for loop, we're going to create a temporary variable. We're going to set it equal to our color button, and then we're just going to change this variable to temp instead. So I know this looks weird, but if you think about it, since we are instantiating this temp button every iteration of the for loop, that variable will never be overwritten. This color button is not being instantiated every iteration of the for loop. It's a part of the for loop, and so you will be overwriting it. Okay. Hopefully that made sense. It's kind of hard to explain, and it's if you test it out yourself, you'll find why and how that works. So there might be something for you to look into yourself. But anyways, okay, so we've now given the button this listener, so it has a function attached to it. Okay. Something to note as well is a button can have more than one listener. I could add multiple listeners, and also if I were to add something in the editor, another function right here, it would be able to do both. Okay, so I could do one function here and one function in code, and it would do both. Okay. Now let's finish this change background color. So we know we've been given a button now, and the other thing we need is the background, right? Because we're going to be changing this color. So we are going to need a image component, which is also a UI component, so this will not show up unless you are using UnityEngine.ui. And this will be the background. Okay. So now that we have this button, we know what color we want. So what we're going to do is we're going to get that color, which should be a hexadecimal color. So string color equals color button dot get component image dot, let's see, how do we get this color? Actually, I'm not sure the button has an image. Let's make sure. It does. I guess the other question then is, which color are we changing? If we change this color, then we want this image color. If we want this normal color, that's going to be something different. I think that we want the image color, so we are going to use image. That color, and then we can change this color into a, let's see, let's see what it looks like when it's toString. I'm actually not sure what this looks like, so why don't we test that out real quick. Because basically we want some kind of hexadecimal or some way to, let's see, that didn't work. Let's figure out why this isn't working. Oh, I mean, I don't debug the color, so it is working. I'm just not seeing what the color is. There we go. Okay, so this gives us an RGBA string. Let's figure out how we can turn a string into a color. So if we take a string, or yeah, let's take a string. Actually, I believe there's something called a color utility. There is. So we can turn, here we go, this is what we would use. So using color utility, we're going to HTML string, it takes in a color. Okay? Oops. There's our color. So this will turn it into an HTML string, RGB, which is why there's a color here. And then now, we can set the background to that color. So background.color equals color utility. In fact, we don't even have to go through this convoluted process. If we wanted to save the color, we would. But we can also just directly set the background color. Right? Yeah. So actually much more simple than I thought. But that happens sometimes. So this will just change the background color to the color of the image. Okay? No conversion needed. And then now let's just set the colors of these buttons. So let's make this red, make this gray, let's green. Sorry, I don't think you can see the color wheel. Let me move this over here. Blue, purple. Let's do a darker blue, orange, Let's do black. And let's do white as well. Okay, and let's see what happens. I did not give it the background. Just remembered that. That would produce an error. This has no background image, so let's give it this panel. This panel has the background. I should actually rename that. Background. Okay. There we go. Able to change the color. Okay. So again, this was originally about PlayerPrefs. So now let's use this with PlayerPrefs. So with PlayerPrefs, we need to store the most recently used color. Okay? And so this is where I actually do need a string of the color, which is going to be equal to background.color. This will be using color utility. And then we'll do two HTML string. Let's use RGBA in case we want some transparent color. The A is the alpha value, which is for transparency. I don't think we're going to want transparency, but you could also just use RGB, just with no transparency value. Okay, and then now we have the color that we picked. We want to store this in PlayerPrefs. So we're going to say PlayerPrefs dot set key, or let's see, in this case it's a string. This string, let's just call it color. So this key, this is what I was mentioning earlier in this video. This key is how we will access this information later. Okay, so it's going to be called color. The value is going to be color. This color right here. Okay? And that's how we will know which background color. And then every time you change the color, it's going to overwrite this with a new string. Okay? And we need one more function. This one can be private. And this will be load background color. It doesn't need a button. And we're going to grab that string information. So we're going to have a string color equals PlayerPrefs dot get string color. And now you'll notice getString has an overload where it has a default value. We don't want a default value in this case. A lot of times you do, but in this case, if there is no background color, so if color equals string.empty, actually we want to check if it's not equal to string.empty, then we know that there's a background color, and so we're going to grab our, we're going to grab our background, and we're going to use color utility to try to parse HTML string, and we're going to give it color. Okay. This takes in. Oh, okay. I see. So we actually don't even need. So this uses an out, which means if it gets a background color, or if it gets a color from the parsing of the HTML string, it's going to put it into whatever this out is. So we can just plug in the background.color here instead, or not. Oh, we just have to say the word out first, of course. Okay, so proper Unix can't be passed. We can't do it that way. So instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to create a new color. We're just going to call it coal. And that's fine. We don't need to give it anything. We're going to out coal, and then we're going to set background.color to be equal to coal. Okay. And then we will call this in start. It doesn't matter if we call it before or after this for each loop, but let's just call it after. So we'll call load background color. Okay. And then now let's take a look how this works. So I've got this green background color. Should have saved it in PlayerPrefs. Let's start it again. And it picked white. Okay, so it's coming up with a blank color, I believe. Let's actually debug.log color. That was dumb of me. Debug.log color. There we go. So there's our color. That is not white. So something's going wrong with this try parse. Okay, so the reason why try parse isn't working is because the string needs a £sign before it. Okay? Let's try that again. And it already worked, actually, but okay. Blue. Now it's blue. Purple or pink or whatever. Now it's pink. Okay. I'm not quite sure why when color utility creates an HTML string, it doesn't put a £sign in front. But anyways, so that's how PlayerPrefs works. This was just a simple example. One last thing that we can do is we can mark which of these buttons is the currently highlighted button. I think that's more complicated than this video needs to be, so I'm not going to do that, but you might want to do that. It'd be a nice thing to learn how to do. You would have to go through all the buttons in the beginning, find which one has the color of the same as the PlayerPrefs color, and then you would somehow have to change the art a little bit to represent that that's the selected button. And then every time you select a new button, you would change that art as well. But that's the basic idea. I didn't use the settings button, so let's do that real quick, just to finish off this video. So this should be turned off, and we would need access, or we don't even need access to the settings panel. Instead, what we do, actually we do, my mistake. So we'll have a public game object, and this will be the settings panel, and we'll have a void, another function. Okay. Let's call this toggle settings panel. Doesn't need to take anything in. And then using this settings panel, we'll determine if the settings panel is active or not. It's active self. I don't believe it's a function, no. So this lets us know if the panel is currently active. And what we want to do now is set the panel to the opposite of whatever it is currently now. This will allow us to toggle the panel off and on. Okay? This shouldn't be private, it has to be public. And then we will go back into Unity. Here's where we will just add an on-click event. We'll grab the settings manager, we'll plug in the function toggle settings panel, and we have not added the settings panel yet, so we will do that as well. Okay. And then now, let's see. Did I add the wrong? Oh, I added the settings button, not the settings panel. That's why it toggled itself. There we go. Change the color. Go back. Change the color. Pause. Hit play again, and PlayerPrefs. Okay. So that's how to do PlayerPrefs. It's probably more simple than JSON for a lot of things. But once again, I wouldn't suggest using it to save anything that isn't some kind of settings related information or any any static information. Okay? Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful. And I will see you all again soon.